So we're going to pick it up where we left off yesterday on the top of Chaf Aleph Amud Beis. Tanan Hossam. So if you count down from the top of the Amud, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 lines down after the two dots, we learned in a Mishnah that we're dealing with now the Melach that was owned by the Tzibur, and it was purchased by the Mammon of Hegdesh from the Trumas Halishka, al hamelach v'al ha'etzim shiyu ha'kohanim ne'osim bahem. That the Chachamim, the Bezdin, made a try that the Kohanim would be allowed to use that melach and the etzim for their karbanos. Omar Shmuel lo shanu el lekarbanom, aval achila lo. The permissibility here based on the Tanai of Bezdin for the Kohanim to use the melach for their karbanos is only for their karbanos. In other words, they could add salt to the karban because we have a mitzvah called karbanecha tochal tasim lelach. Aval achila, but let's say when the Kohanim want to eat, for example, in the case of Shlomim, they get the shok, or in the case of chatos v'yosham, they get the shirayim for achila. They cannot use the salt to prepare their karbanos for achila, only for the carbon itself, for the hakarava. Kasalka daitoch. At this point in the Gemara, we think that ma'ila karbanam limloch karbanam. When Shmuel limits the heter of the Tanai Bezdin for the karban of the Kohanim, that's only for the malicha of their karbanos. But l'achila, it's achilas kodshim. They cannot use the melach to add to the achila of the karbanos that they're allowed to eat. And the Gemara doesn't understand. Hashta limloch oros kodshim yavinon. We're going to soon learn from a brisa that anybody of any one of the Kohanim who wants to take the hides that he received as part of the chalukah of the karbanos, which are given, the hides are given to the Kohanim, and he wants to salt them and tan them, is yavinon. He's allowed to take from the salt, the melach that belongs to the tzibur from the lishkas ha-melach, and he could use that to salt his hides. Is lachilas kodesh lo yavinon? It's not logical, it's not possible to say that we're only going to allow him to use the salt, the melach of Hegdesh, for the purpose of tanning his hides, but not for the purpose of achila. Desanya, now I want to prove to you that you could use, the Kohanim will use the melach of the Trumas Halishka of Hegdesh for purposes of tanning their hides. Nimtzeis ata omer b'shlosha makomos hamelach nesuna. There were 3 lishkos where the melech was stored. Number 1, belishkas hamelach, and each one the Brisa is going to tell you what it was used for. Number 2 is al gabi hakevesh, right up the ramp, up to the mizbeach, they had a storehouse of salt, and berosha shel mizbeach, on the top of the mizbeach. Number 1, belishkas hamelach. Why was there a storage of salt in the lishka? What did they do with the chamber, that special room that was designated for the melach? Shesham molchim oros kodshim. And this is the most important part of the brisa for our purposes, that they would take the salt from the lishkas hamelach and they would use it to salt their hides, the oros that they received from the kodshim, from the karbanos. Al gabi hakevesh. Then there was a storehouse of salt on the top of the ramp. Shesham molchem evarim. That's where they did the malicha of the limbs of the carbon itself. And barosh shel mizbeach shesham molchem hakomitz valavona. Anything that was completely burnt on the mizbeach required malicha, and the malicha was implemented on the top of the mizbeach. So we mentioned here the kometz that has to be burnt on the mizbeach. Number 2, the levona that accompanies the kometz has to be burnt on the mizbeach. Minchas kohanim. which is a reference to those menachos that are brought by the Kohanim, that it's kulo kolo, it's completely burnt on the Mizbeach. U'minchas Kohen Mashiach, that's the daily mincha of Chavitin of the Kohen Gadol, once in the morning, once in the afternoon, and it's kulo kolo, completely burnt. U'minchas Nesachim is completely burnt, and Olas Ha'of. All these, the salting process was done on the top of the Mizbeach. In any event, we see clearly that as far as using the melach for salting the hides, the Kohanim were allowed to do so. And if they were allowed to do that, then how much more so should be they allowed, by virtue of the Tanai Bezdin, to use the salt for the Achilas Karbanos. Elamai, so now the Gemara has to reinterpret Shmuel. Elamai lekarbanam leachilas karbanam. When Shmuel allowed the salt through this Tanai Bezdin to be used by the Kohanim for the carbon, he meant for achilas carbon. So when they're eating the kodshim and they want to salt the kodshim, that they're allowed to do, and use the salt of the trumas alishka, of the tzibur. However, my lachila, where did Shmuel put his foot down and say, no, this they cannot do with the salt of Hegdesh? That's with regard to achilas chulin. And as I said yesterday, we'll repeat it again, this doesn't make any sense because there's no chulin that goes into the azara. Chulin pshita, my bo hasa. What is chulin doing in the azara? And the Gemara answers, afal gav the omar mar yochlu, even though the pasuk says yochlu, sheyochlu ima chulin utruma kadeshi ter nechelas ala sova vafilu hachimel tekodshim lo yavina. It means the following, that in the mitzvah of achilas kodshim on the part of the Kohanim, there's a halacha of ala sova. Now, if the komets, which is matir the shirayim for achilas kohanim, there's a meager portion of shirayim from this komets, it's not going to satiate the kohen, so therefore he has to eat other things to fill up his belly before he eats the komets, or I should say the shirayim of the komets. And therefore, I would doubt whether or not, for the purpose of ala sova, you could wonder whether or not we would allow the Kohanim to utilize the salt on chulin or truma in order to fill themselves up and satiate themselves, so that now they could eat the carbon ala sova. And one could argue in both directions. On the one hand, you're taking the kodshim and you're going to eat it, use it to salt this truma and this chulin outside of the azara. But on the other hand, it's part of the mitzvah of achilas kodshim. And therefore, we're going to say that if the Kohen wants to eat the chulin together with his kodshim, meaning in preparation for his achilas kodshim, in order that the achilas kodshim be ala sova, then we would entertain the possibility that we're going to permit the Kohanim to take the salt of the tzibur of Hegdesh and use it for this purpose. Kamashmal and Shmuel says, no, Adkan, this is not permissible. We can allow the Kohanim to use the salt of Hegdesh for salting the karbanos as part of the hakrava, but not for achilas hakarban, even if the salt is being used. Again, when I say achilas hakorban, I mean for the chulin that's meant to prepare the kohanim for the achilas kodshim, that they can't do. As far as using the salt for the kodshim themselves and putting the salt on the kodshim at the time of the achila, that is part of the Tanai Beis, and that's mut. Amalei Ravina l'Ravashi. Ravina wants to support this interpretation of Shmuel. Hachida mistabra, it's logical. The isal kedaikav ma'ila korbanam limloach. If we want to interpret Shmuel's statement that the heter of the salt for the kohanim, the salt of Hegdesh, is for their karban, is limloach. What are you telling me? That we needed a Tanai Bezdin limloach to allow the malicha, which is part of the hakrav of the korban, time of the asnei bezdin, holo asnei bezdin lo. How could that be? We're going to use this salt for all the korbanos. Hashtali Yisrael yavinon lekanim lo yavinon. Does it cross anyone's mind that we can allow using the salt of Hegdesh to prepare the korban of a Yisrael, but not for the korban of a Kohen? Why should the Kohen be any worse than the Yisrael? And the Gemara says, I'm going to prove to you from a brisa that you could use the salt of Hegdesh for the purpose of preparing the korbanos. Tisanya, ha'omer harei alai mincha, yavi melach mitov beso. A person takes upon himself a pledge to bring a mincha, and he needs to salt the mincha because that's a korban, like any korban that needs salting. So the question is, does he bring the salt from his own house, his own privately owned salt, and he brings it to the Mikdash in order to salt the mincha that he promised, he pledged to bring? Or shall we say, no, he could use the melach from Hegdesh? So one argument goes that he should be able to use the melech of Hegdesh. Why? I'm sorry, that he should be required, according to this first svara, and then we'll get to the other svara, to bring his own personal salt, kiderech shemevi levona mitoch beso. In the case of a levona, for example, the mincha has to be accompanied by a levona, then that levona is brought by the Kohen from his house, privately owned. And v'dinu, and therefore it's logical that Nemar, in the Torah it says, Havei mincha ve'havei melach. And when you bring the mincha, you're going to bring the levona from your house. And Nemar Havei mincha ve'havei levona. So in both cases, whether it's levona, where it says Havei, and we mean to say that it requires that you bring your own levona, and it also says Havei, with regard to the salt, is therefore ma levona mitov beso af melach betov beso. So at this point in the brisa is presenting a thesis that the melach for the korban mincha has to be brought by the Kohen from his own private storage of salt. Oh, now the brisa says maybe we could take it a different way. Maybe we could compare the melach not to the levona, which, as we said before, the levona has to be brought privately owned from the bias of the Kohen, but rather let's compare it to eitzim. The eitzim that we use to burn the fire on the mizbeach so that we could be maktir the korban, that was eitzim that came from the Hegdesh. And therefore, let's compare melach to eitzim. Go down this path. Nemar hevi mincha ve'hevi melach. Nemar hevi mincha v'havei eitzim. Ma eitzim mishal tzibur, af melach mishal tzibur. So the melach could be brought from the communally owned melach, just like the eitzim came from the communally owned eitzim. So now we have sort of like a split parshas drachim. We can go in one of two ways. Should we compare melach to levona, and then we're going to require that he comes from his own, or should we compare melach to eitzim? So the Brisa says, we should really compare it to eitzim, because just like melach is a requirement for all zvachim, all karbonos require melach, so too all karbonos have to be burnt on the fire that was lit by the eitzim. Levona only applies to mincha and to the shtei alechem of the kivsei atzeres of Shavuot, but levona is not a common requirement in all. Or maybe on the other hand, there's more of a pressing logic to compare melach to levona. The melach becomes part of the carbon, and the levona becomes part of the mincha. Why? Because done in davar ba imo b'kliyechad, mi davar ba imo b'kliyechad. Eitzim is out of the picture here. The levona is very much in the picture because the levona together with the mincha are brought in one kli. And that kli is mitzarif them together, integrating them into one whole. And therefore, just like the mincha itself is hegdesh, so too the levona should be hegdesh, and the levona should come mishal tzibur. Okay, so at this point, we're really at a dead end. We don't know whether to compare melach to eitzim or to levona. Talmud Lomar, therefore, the Brisa finishes up with the finale of a pasuk. It says, "Bris melach olam hu." He. So let's emphasize the word bris with regard to melach. Ulahalanu omer, in regard to the lechem aponim, it says, "Me'es b'nei Yisrael bris olam." So we have now the word bris again in the context of the lechem aponim. Ma lahal b'shal tzibur. Of course, the lechem aponim comes from the tzibur. It's a carbon tzibur. It's afkan. The Torah wanted to compare melach to a carbon tzibur, and the melach comes mishal tzibur. It'll come from the funds of the tzibur. Therefore, we see clearly from this brisa that Bnei Yisrael, meaning leave out the Kohanim for a minute, are allowed to use the melach of the tzibur for the sake of their karbanos, and therefore Kohanim should also be permitted to do so. And therefore, Ravina had argued that Tanai Bezdin, which allowed the Kohanim to benefit from the melach of the tzibur, is not referring to the hakrov itself, to burning the karbanos. That doesn't need a Tanai Bezdin, but rather to the, as we said before, the achila, when the Kohanim want to eat the kochim, shlomim, and ola, and not ola is cool, we call it, but shlomim, and we mentioned chatas and osham, then they cannot use the salt of the tzibur for salting their achila, or possibly to use it for salting their chulin or truma outside of the azara, and then going into the azara to eat the shirayim bisvir, kedei svir. So all this is Ravina. I have another tradition against Ravina that could be attributed to Rav Shisha. Lo nitzucha el ben Bukhri. You know why we need a Tanai in order to allow the Kohanim to benefit from the melach of the tziva? That's because of Ben Bukhri. Ben Bukhri was one of the Chachamim who testified in front of the other Chachamim that the Kohanim are not obligated in the Machzis HaShekel, which is the annual gift that was given for the Lishkas, Trumas HaLishka, for the purpose of buying Korbanos Tzibur. Every Jew had to bring annually a Machzis HaShekel, with the exception, according to Ben Bukhri, of the Kohanim. And the Kohanim did not have to contribute a Machzis HaShekel. This is not, as we learned in the Mishnah in Shkolim. Rabbi Yehuda Heid Ben Bukhri b'Yavna. Ben Bukhri testified in front of the Chachamim in Yavne. Kol Kohen sheshokel eino chote. If a Kohen decides on his own initiative to voluntarily offer a Machzis HaShekel, he's not a chote, which means that according to the strict letter of the law, the Kohen is not obligated to offer a Machzis HaShekel. If he does so, it's not called Chulin Lazora, and therefore it's permissible. Now, let's try to understand the logic behind Rav Yehuda's statement in the name of Ben Bukhri. The Torah says that who has to bring the machzah shekel? It's called a over al hapkudim, which means anyone, any shevet that's counted. And the shevet of the Kohanim was not counted. It wasn't part of the pekudim in Sefer Bamidbar. And therefore, they're not included, according to Ben Bochari, in the obligation of machzis hashekel, because machzis hashekel is only over al pekudim. However, Amalo Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai lo ki ella kol kohen she'eino shokel chote. On the contrary, don't be machadish to me that the kohen on his own voluntary initiative could bring a machzah shekel and it's not chulun azor. On the contrary, says Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, the kohenim, like all of Klal Yisrael, are chayev min Torah to give a machzah shekel on an annual basis. And the reason for that is because Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai holds that when it says kol over al pekudim, it's not excluding the kohanim, because the kohanim are also included in the obligation of machzis hashekel, no less than anyone else in Klal Yisrael. And even though they weren't counted in the pekudim, but kol over means avru es hayarden, avru es hayamsuf, that any Jew that was saved by Kriyas Yamsuf, was part of Kriyas Yamsuf, and crossed over dry land, is chayev in machzah shekel, including the kohanim. Ela shakonim dorshin mikra zeli atzmon. The kohanim came up with a drasha of their own, based on a pasuk, and they derive from this drasha that they do not participate in machzah shekel. What was the drasha? It says v'chol minchas kohen kolil tia lo sei ochel. Right, the minchas kohen has to be completely burnt, and no part of his shirayim is eaten by anybody else. And now the kohenim came up with the following logic: if they will participate in the machzah shekel, then the carbon that's purchased from the machzah shekel, which is meant to be a carbon tzibur, it can't be a carbon tzibur because some of that money has to go from minchas kohen, and a minchas kohen is kulo kolil. So what's going to happen is that the kohenim's logic is if they contribute a machzah shekel, then any time that Bezdin will purchase, the Hegdish will purchase from the Trumas HaLishka, which is the sum total of all the machzah shekels, it will partially belong to them. Because anyone who contributes to the machzah shekel, it belongs to them. Now, if that be the case, then how could you buy a mincha for a Yisrael and it really belongs to the Kohen? And then and if it's right, he has partial ownership, and therefore the minchas Kohen has to be burnt kuli kolil. Cholil the omer shtei lechem v'lechem aponim shalonu hi heichne cholim. And furthermore, there are karbonos tzibur that are purchased from the money of the machzah shekel and the trumas halishka. For example, the omer that's brought on the 16th of Nisan, shtei lechem that's brought on Shavuos, lechem aponim, which is a weekly gift. They're all now meant to be a carbon tzibur, purchased from, as it were, the Trumas HaLishka, and yet the Trumas HaLishka is sachakol, at the end of the day, money that was contributed by the Kohanim as well. And if the Kohanim contributed money for the Trumas HaLishka, then all these karbanos really belong to them, and therefore it's not a carbon tzibur, hechnech cholim. How could they be eaten, after all, if any of the menachos that you buy from the Trumas HaLishka belong to the Kohanim as well, because they contributed to the machzah shekel, to the Trumas HaLishka, then it has to be burnt on the mizbeach. However, says Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, despite the logic and the argument of the Kohanim, nevertheless the Torah says that it doesn't matter. The Kohanim are obligated in Trumas HaLishka. Okay, now, Ben Bukhari, let's go back to Ben Bukhari, who says that the Kohanim are not part of the chiyuv of machzah shekel. How do we have a voluntary machzah shekel, it's an impossibility, because if it's chulin, then you can't bring the chulin into the azara. And the Gemara answers the Maisi Umasalu Tzibur. Before they gave their machzah shekel, they made a tanai and had a complete communis das that it should be given over to the tzibur, and therefore they removed their personal private ownership over any of the shkolim. Now we go to the Gemara of Rav Shisha. Right, Rav Shisha said that the reason for the Tanai Bezdin, which allows the Kohanim to derive benefit from the salt that belongs to Hegdish, belongs to the Tzibur, is only necessary according to Ben Bukhri. Right, because again, according to Ben Bukhri, the Kohanim are not obligated in Machzis HaShekel, and therefore, if they're not obligated, so then the question is, they don't have a part, they don't have an ownership part in those, in the melach that's purchased from the Trumas Halishka, because they didn't contribute to the Trumas Halishka, and therefore we need a Tanai Bezdin to permit the Kohanim to take from the salt of the Trumas Halishka and use it for their karbonos. Salke Taitechamina. Today's daf is daf chaf beis. Ki zachilu rachmana li Yisrael de isluhu lishka l'konim de lesluhu lishka lo zachilu rachmana kamash malan. Now we can understand why the Mishnah says that the only reason the Kohanim are allowed to benefit from the salt of the Trumas HaLishka of the Tzibur is because of the Tanai Bezdin. Because without the Tanai Bezdin, since we're going according to Ben Bukhri, that the Kohanim are exempt from contributing the Machzah Shekel, they don't have any ownership rights in that which belongs to the Tzibur. They're completely excluded. And therefore they should not be allowed to eat the salt or use the salt from the Trumas Halishka from the Tzibur, except for the fact that Bezdin made it tonight. Now, keep in mind that we had this, this original logic of Ravina, and Rav Shisha rejected that logic, and he says that the Mishnah is requiring a Tanai Bezdin in order to allow the Kohanim to use the Melach because of Ben Bukhri. Ravina said, if you recall, back on the previous Amud, that since the Yisraelim are allowed to use the Melach, then certainly, right, for their karbonos, certainly the Kohanim are allowed to use the karbonos. But that doesn't make sense and cannot be accepted according to Ben Bukhri, because there's a fundamental difference between the Kohanim and the Yisraelim. The Yisraelim chipped in and contributed the Machzah Shekel they're required to give on an annual basis, and therefore they own the Melach Shel Tzibur. But the Kohanim, who, according to Ben Bukhri, are exempt and do not participate in the Trumas HaLishka, therefore they cannot benefit without a Tanai Bezdin from the Melach that was purchased by the Trumas HaLishka. Now, way back when, on Daf Chaf Aleph, Amid Aleph, we learned that the Eitzim have to come Mishal Tzibur. So the Gemara now wants to know, the Eitzim the Pshitale the Tana Mishal Tzibur Minol, how did the Tana know that it's obvious that the Eitzim come Mishal Tzibur? And the Gemara answers this sign we learned to the Brisa. Yochel HaOmer Harei Olai Ola. Yavi Eitzim Isoch Beso, a person takes upon himself a pledge voluntarily to bring a carbon ola, and the ola has to be burnt on the Mizbeach. I might think that he has to bring the wood and supply it from his own personal storehouse of privately owned wood. Just like there's halacha with regard to Nesachim, that he has to bring it from his own house. Talmud Lomar, but we have a pasuk that says Al Eitzim Hashalom Mizbeach Hashalom. Notice that the word Eitzim is formulated in the context of the Mizbeach, and this gives us a hekesh between the Mizbeach and the Eitzim. Now, one of the elements of the Mizbeach is that it's purchased and structured from the ownership of the Tzibur. You or I don't build the mizbeach. Is ma mizbeach shall tzibraf eitzim v'eshel shall mishal tzibur. Divrei Rabbi Elazar Reb Shimon. Now watch this. Rabbi Elazar ben Shamua is going to derive at the same conclusion, but in a different way. Ma mizbeach, let's accept this working hekesh between eitzim and mizbeach. Shalom nishtamish bo hedjot. In other words, a mizbeach requires kiddush, and the kiddush, the sanctification of the mizbeach, will only apply to, so to speak, a new mizbeach. What do I mean by a new mizbeach? It's a mizbeach that was never used by any hedjot, by anyone else. Is af eitzim v'yesh lo nishtamish bahen hedjot. So the eitzim could not come from the private storehouse of the person who was being makriv the ola. It's got to come from the Trumas al-Lishka, and then we know for sure that it's brand new eitzim that was never used for any personal use. And therefore it's similar to Mizbeach. My benayu, hika benayu chadati. The difference between Rabbi Elazar ben Shamua would be if, let's say, you had wood that was brand new, and it was never used for any other purpose. According to Rabbi Elazar ben Shamua, that wood would be allowed to be used for the carbon. But according to Rabbi Elazar ben Shamua, the wood is allowed to have been used previously, and therefore, even if the wood was already used, as long as it's coming mishal tzibur, then the wood is. So again, do you require brand new wood that was never used? That's a machlokus between Rabbi Elazar ben Shamua and Rabbi Elazar ben Shimon. Frekti Gemara, according to Rabbi Elazar ben Shamua, you're telling me that if the wood was used in the past, it cannot be used on the Mizbeach. Vatiki lo vaksiv. What about the pasuk about our Ravna? Ravna was the head of the Yevusim, and David HaMelech purchased from Aravna the land for the Beis HaMikdash. And Vayomer Aravna David, and Aravna says in honor of David, Yikach, this is in Shmuel, Yikach v'ya'al Adoni HaMelech HaTov be'enov. In other words, he speaks to David HaMelech as the Adoni HaMelech, my master, the king, and whatever you think finds favor in your eyes, you can be makriv, you can v'yal means you're offered up on that in that land. Re'eya bakali olav hamorigin. Okay, we don't know what morigin is. That's going to come later on. But habaka ukleya bakala eitzin. So again, this pasuk talks about David HaMelech's purchase of the future site of the Beis HaMikdash, meaning the Mikdash of Shlomo HaMelech, the first Mikdash, from Aravna the Yevusi, and Aravna offers his cattle as offering for the Mizbeach, plus wooden farming implements to be used as firewood. And l'chora, those instruments were used in the past. How can he take the wood from these implements, these farming tools, and use them for eitzim to burn on the mizbeach for the korbanos? I mean, we're holding now, according to Rabbi Elazar ben Shamua, you need chadati, you need brand new ones. So David HaMelech accepted these wooden farming elements because they were never used in the past. My morigin, and what is this word morigin? Amar ula mita shel turbal. Okay, my mita shel turbal. Amar Rabbi Yehuda Isa de durkisa. Okay, it was kind of like a weight that was placed down on a spiked board. Okay, and the dashu be dashtoi, and they used it to thresh the grains in the thresh head. And Omer of Yosef, my crow, is the pasuk that supports this interpretation, and the Gemara quotes a pasuk Hanach, Hine samtich lemorag charutz chadash baal pifios tadush harim. Behold, I have made of you a new sharp morag with many sharp edges. You can thresh mountains, grind them small, and we talk about a morag as something that was never used. The Mishnah says, Nis arev kumtza bekometz chaverta. Let's say you have two menachos, and they got mixed up. one kometz was a regular kometz of a Yisrael, and the other was a minchas kohen, or a regular kometz of a Yisrael got mixed up with a minchas kohen Mashiach, or in the third case, the regular kometz got mixed up with a minchas nesachim. The Tanakama says, Ksher Rabbi Yehuda Omer, no, it's not always going to be kosher. This mixture creates a problem. The minchas kohen Mashiach, minchas nesachim psula. If the mincha got mixed up with either a minchas kohen or a minchas nesachim, psula. Why? Shezubli lasa rogav zubli lasa raka. Vein bolos zumizu. Let's explain Rabbi Yehuda. There's a fundamental difference between a classic minchas nidava, when you or I offer a voluntary mincha, and the minchas kohanim and the minchas nisachim. Why? In the case of a common mincha, the ratio between the oil that you mix into the flour is 1 log shemen for an isaron of fine flour. In the cases of a minchas nesachim or a minchas kohen Mashiach, the ratio is 3 logim of shemen to an isaron. So there's 3 times as much shemen in these two menachos, shel kohanim or shel nesachim, as compared to 1/3 of the amount of oil in the case of a classic minchas nidava. Now, the more oil that you add in to the mixture of the flour, the more liquidy it becomes. And therefore, the mincha of a nidava, which has only 1 log to an isaron, that 1 log gets absorbed into the isaron and it becomes almost completely dry. Very little liquid there, very little actual shemen left. It's almost all absorbed. But not so in the case of these two menachos, because there the ratio is 3 times as much shemen, and therefore it's very liquidy. And what's going to happen is, because one mincha is very dry and the other mincha is very wet, liquidy, therefore there's going to be a blia, there's going to be absorption of one mincha from the other to make up for the lack of oil, or to add to the oil. So either you're subtracting some of the oil from the 3 lugim in these two menachos, or you're adding oil that's nivla in the minchas nedava. And we have 2 types of psulim. There's a psul if you add too much oil. There's a psul if you don't have enough oil. So either way, says Rabbi Yehuda, it's going to be possible. Tanan Hassam, the Gemara quotes a Mishnah in Zvachim. Dam shenis arif b'mayim im yesh bo maris dam kosher. So even though the mayim got mixed up with the dam, but since the dam has a predominant color and it looks like dam, therefore you could use it on the mizbech and do the zrika of that dam. This arif b'yayin. What happens if it gets mixed up with yayin? Now, yayin is also red, like the dam, so really it's very hard to know whether or not it looks like this or it looks like that, because they both look the same. Is therefore roem oso keilu mayim. In other words, we imagine that the yayin itself keilu was water, and we would ask what volume of water would it take to change the color of the dam. Nisarif dam behema, bedam chaya. Rom also keiluhu mayim. Once again, we're going to use the same kind of measuring. And Rabbi Yehuda says, no, ein dam mevatel dam. That if you have 2 damim, even though there's enough of one carbon that if you would convert it into mayim, it would undermine the color. It doesn't matter. We have halacha, says Rabbi Yehuda, that ein dam mevatel dam. In kodshim, ein dam mevatel dam. Rabbi Yochanan says shneim mikra echad darshu. We have the same pasuk that can be interpreted 2 ways. It says, now this has to do with the avoda of the Kohen Gadol on Yom Kippurim, And the Torah says, "V'lakach midam apor midam asoyer." The Torah tells the Kohen Gadol that he has to take from the dam of the par, which is a large animal, and the dam of the soyer of the goat, which is relatively small. So there's a greater volume of the dam of the par than there is of the dam of the soyer. Mix it together, and the Torah says you apply it to the mizbeach. Hadov yadush adamu shel par merubim midav shel soyer. And yet the Torah says combine these two damim, mix them together, and go ahead and do the hazoyos, even though in this case the dam hapar is that much greater than the dam hasoyer. We still call it, the Torah calls it dam hasoyer, even after the mixture. So you see, says Rabbi Yehuda, that there's no bittul because they're both dam. If they're both dam, that's called min b'mino, and min b'mino barov einu batel. And not only that, even be'elef it's einu batel. Rabbanan Savri, and the Rabbanan disagree. And what do they hold?